no introduction, unless we don't have her. She deserves to be introduced. She's actually just such an amazing teacher and mentor and leader in our community. So it is our absolute privilege to be able to learn Dr. Sarah and Benor today. Sarah is the Vice Provost, I almost said Assistant Associate Provost, Vice Provost at HHD and Professor of Contemporary Jewish Studies, an amazing teacher, an amazing scholar, so much richness. We are in for.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay? There's a lot of noise.
Yeah.
So yeah. I'll try to use the mic here. Let me know if you can't hear. So I'm going to start with the Midrash, that the Israelites were worthy of redemption from Egypt because of a number of things that they did or didn't do. And in that list is that they did not change their language, their names, or their dress. Now, throughout history, Jews did change their language many times. And these changes have been key to our survival as a people, as a minority group, being both a part of and apart from the surrounding society. But these changes in language are currently leading to significant loss. And now is the time to act, to document these endangered Jewish languages. So before we get started on the content of today's talk, tell me some Jewish languages that you know, that you can have a conversation in.
That I can personally?
Yeah, you personally. Yeah. I heard Hebrew. Any other languages? Aramaic. Okay. Okay, well you can read it. You know it. You know it enough to read it. Okay. What's that? Sarcasm does not count. Yeah.
But that's actually so we can read it. So I can read Yiddish.
Okay.
I can read Ladino. Spanish when they go on a fighting chance of understanding the person. So if you said to me, am I proficient in any of the above? The answer, no.
Okay, so you can read it, and which gets to our next question, which is Jewish languages you have engaged with. Maybe you have read something in it or had a little conversation or sung a song in that language. Aside from Hebrew, Aramaic, sarcasm, Yiddish, and Ladino, what are any other languages that you've engaged with? Jewish languages. Okay, in what way have you engaged with it?
I'm a Jewish organization, so periodically I have someone who comes out of Morocco or Yemen, who speak out of Arabic. Even then, Yemenites I might be hearing what they know. This is fascinating to see what comes out of what's going to figure out.
Wow, really interesting. Any other languages you've
Not
engaged
official
with?
languages, but there's, like Jewish camp languages.
Okay, yeah, no one's mentioned Jewish English yet, but I think we're all fluent, right? And in different varieties of Jewish English and Camp Hebraized English, which I wrote a book about. But here's the third question. What are other Jewish languages that you've heard of? Jewish Malayalam, or in southern India, like Kochi. Okay, well that's a lot. I mean, I think you're kind of unusual for a contemporary American Jew that you've been exposed to and are aware of the existence of many Jewish languages. So first today I'm going to answer that question. What are Jewish languages? Where are or were they spoken? Why did Jews stop speaking long-standing languages? Are Jewish languages endangered? And how are Jews maintaining connections to their ancestral languages? Now this might seem like a strange topic for a high holiday prep, but I do see this as an important issue in contemporary Jewish life and in the world more broadly, because this is really a human rights issue. When people's languages become endangered, It is taking a part of them away, and a part of their group, their ancestral group, away from them. So let's start with the first two questions. Okay, that little purple dot in the middle of the screen, land of Israel, when Jews were left the land of Israel, were expelled or moved for other reasons, they ended up in various parts of North Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. And in each place that they moved to, they picked up the local language and Judaified it. That is, they spoke it with distinctive features, especially Hebrew words. And the two most famous Jewish languages, Yiddish and Ladino, are actually exceptions in this history. Why? Because they were maintained for centuries away from the place where they originated, and they were spoken in a land where people spoke a totally different language. So throughout history, Jews have usually spoken a variety of the local non-Jewish language, demonstrating both their being a part of and apart from society. And Jews have spoken dozens of languages, changing their language, like that Midrash says not to do, many times. So, and the Jewish languages that we're talking about here are mostly the non-Jewish base language with distinctive features, especially Hebrew words. Now you might be saying, well, aren't these just dialects of the local language? Yes, they might be, but it's very hard to answer that question. And instead, I like to think of these languages as existing on a continuum, from least distinct, meaning most similar to the surrounding society, to most distinct. And on one side, you would have languages like Jewish Amharic, which was quite similar to the other Amharic varieties around it, and medieval Judeo-French and Judeo-Persian. The written documentation we have of those languages was quite similar to medieval French and Persian. And of course, Yiddish and Ladino are on the very distinct end because they're spoken with a different language as the surrounding language. And then in the middle, we have all these other languages like Judeo-Greek, Jewish Malayalam, Italian, Arabic, Neo-Aramaic, which was a bit more distinct. So now we get to the question, why did Jews stop speaking long-standing languages? A number of factors here. First, assimilation, both external and internal pressures to assimilate, the emancipation, the Haskalah, and then migration. Jews urbanized in the 19th century and 20th centuries, and also emigration to escape poverty, discrimination, and violence. And so here's a very messy rendition of some migration patterns of Jews. The red arrows are moving to the New World, the black arrows are moving to Israel, and the purple arrows are moving to Western Europe. And then, of course, genocide. The Holocaust led to the endangerment of several Jewish languages, like not Yiddish, but it had a big impact because most of the people killed in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers. Ladino, Judeo-Italian, Judeo-Greek, and Krimchak, which was a language spoken by Jews in the Crimean Peninsula, a Turkic language. And then in the 1950s, Stalinism also targeted Yiddish writers and actors in particular. And another factor in language endangerment is nationalist language policies. That is, when the government says, we want to foster a sense of national identity, so everybody needs to learn standard Persian or standard French or whatever. And this was a huge factor in the educational systems in Israel and the United States, where the majority of the world's Jews currently live. So these factors, these external and internal factors that I've been talking about, lead to the prestige of the new language and the stigma of the old language. And that leads parents to speak a new language to their children, and children reject their parents' language if they had continued to speak it. And eventually this leads to the death of the last speaker, which leads to language dormancy. And we don't like to say the language is extinct because there's always the possibility of revitalization. Now, these migrations and language policies and other factors also led to the creation of new Jewish language varieties like Jewish English, Jewish Latin American Spanish, Swedish, Portuguese, French, German, Russian, Hungarian, etc. And these languages are doing great. In fact, I have dictionaries of many of these languages to show how they are distinct from their non-Jewish correlate, like how they use words from Hebrew, from Yiddish, from Ladino, from Judeo-Arabic. So we see that even as Jews are changing their language, like the Midrash mentions, they are maintaining some things from their ancestral traditions. So these languages are thriving and developing. But what about these other languages? Yiddish, Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, etc. How are they doing? That's what I'm going to focus on now with the question, are Jewish languages endangered? So to answer that question, we turn to some tools that people who study these things have created, like the Expanded Graded Intergenerational Disruption Scale. It has different stages that a language might be at. 0 through 6 are good stages. 6B through 10 are not so good. So, and we're going to focus primarily on stages 8A and B, that if a language is moribund, it's the only remaining active users of the language are members of the grandparent generation or older. And then nearly extinct is if that's the case, but they have little opportunity to use the language. And by the way, notice how it's not just about how many speakers there are, it's about the age of the speakers. If most of the speakers of a language are elderly, then that language is endangered. However, these stages are somewhat problematic because they're too black and white. They say things like the only speakers left are, but what if there's like one young person? Does that then say this is no longer an endangered language? Also, in the case of Jewish language varieties, sometimes the speakers acquired a standard variety of the language, but they maintain elements of their ancestors' Jewish variety. So are they then still speakers of Judeo-Italian and Judeo-Greek? Not really, but they have elements of it. Also, there's the issue of language versus dialect. How do we decide if something is a language and therefore that language is endangered? Maybe it's just a dialect of another language and that language isn't endangered, so we're not in bad shape. Well, it's very difficult to distinguish between a language and a dialect, and I won't get into the details now, but that's just a factor to think about. Also, how do you decide who's a speaker of a language? If you say the only speakers are of the grandparent generation, does that mean the only fluent speakers, the only people who use it? What if young people, like someone who works at a Jewish home for the aged, engages with a language? Does that mean that that language is that person a speaker of that language? So even though there are all these issues, I still think these statistics are useful, so I'm going to be giving you some numbers and stages. But another factor that I want to talk about, another phenomenon, is post-vernacularity. And that term comes from research about Yiddish, contemporary American Jews in particular, engagement with Yiddish. And Jeffrey Chandler talks about how most people who use Yiddish words and talk about Yiddish can't understand full Yiddish sentences. They are post-vernacular users of that language. They are engaging with this language in a way that's very different from how their parents or maybe their great-grandparents engaged with Yiddish. And in a post-vernacular setting, the fact that something is said in Yiddish is more significant than what's actually said. For example, we have Yiddish words used within English sentence, Yiddish tchotchkes like, I don't know, refrigerator magnets or stuffed animals or t-shirts. We have Yiddish performance and translation of Yiddish literature into English, but also translation of English, especially children's books, into Yiddish. So these are all post-vernacular forms of engagement with this language. Another relevant construct is meta-linguistic community. That is people who meet to celebrate a language, to engage with a language, but they do it primarily in another language. So these Yiddish clubs that you see pictures for, notice the ads are in English, right? These are English environments where they are celebrating Yiddish. They are gathering around the language. So, are Jewish languages endangered? Yiddish is not. You may have heard that Yiddish is endangered, and that's because a lot of people experience it as endangered because of how their family engages with Yiddish. But it's actually doing very well. Why? Because of Hasidic communities. In Hasidic communities, young people are learning Yiddish the normal way that you learn languages, and therefore it is a vibrant language. Outside of Hasidic communities, there is strong post-vernacular engagement with Yiddish. All of the other long-standing Jewish languages, however, are endangered or close to endangered. And so now I'm going to give you some statistics. You can see here, yes?
Could I ask just a Yiddish question?
Yes.
There's this other phenomenon with Yiddish that it's like popular now on college campuses and stuff, and like you would have never seen Yiddish being offered as a language, and now it's being offered as a language. And where does that fit in? Like,
yeah, that's an example of post-vernacular engagement. Yes, and most of the people who learn Yiddish are not then raising their children in Yiddish, but some are. And so there is Yiddish Woche, which is Yiddish Week in upstate New York, where a few hundred families from around the world, but mostly the US and Canada, come together who are raising their kids in Yiddish. And so there are some people who do that. These are like outside of Hasidic communities, but most of the people who engage with Yiddish are not intending to pass it on to the next generation. Okay, so you'll see some numbers here. You can see that okay, right? The numbers? Okay, so we have this number of speakers in 1900, the number of speakers in 2023, the stage that it's at, and then what post-vernacular activity there is. So, Eastern Yiddish, which is the Yiddish that most American Jews have as part of their family backgrounds, has many fewer speakers than it did in 1900, but it is very alive and well, and there's a lot of post-vernacular activity. Ladino has fewer speakers than it did, and it is moribund, and there is a lot of post-vernacular activity in Ladino as well. Now, Judeo-Persian is an interesting one because historically the term Judeo-Persian just refers to the writing, the written Persian in Hebrew letters. But most Persian Jews today speak Persian, Farsi, with some distinctive Jewish features, mostly some Hebrew words pronounced in distinctive Persian ways, like Shabbat instead of Shabbat, right? And so the number of speakers is less than it was in 1900, but it's still doing pretty well because people of all ages are speaking it. But it's shifting because most Persian Jews left Iran in 1979 and now live in Israel, the US, and elsewhere. Judeo-Arabic has diminished significantly. It is moribund. I'm going to talk more about Judeo-Arabic. Bukharian, so here now we get to some interesting, surprising statistics. What do you notice about the top three in this? It's gone up, yeah. Now you might think, oh, that's good. These languages are doing great. Not at all. What happened here is there was an increase in birth rate and a decrease in infant mortality in the early 20th century. So there was just a major increase in numbers between 1900 and 1980, 2000, but the numbers have been decreasing since as people moved away from Uzbekistan, and where Bukharian is spoken, and Azerbaijan, where Juhuri is spoken, and the Kurdish region of Iran and Iraq, where Jewish Neo-Aramaic was spoken. And so these languages are moribund, except Juhuri is not moribund, it's shifting, because it's still spoken in one town in Azerbaijan called Kirmizi Kasaba, also known as Krasnaya Sloboda, Red Village, and there young people are still speaking Juhuri. But then other languages have much fewer speakers, like Hakitiya, North African Judeo-Spanish, and Jewish Iranian, which I'll talk more about in a minute, and Judeo-Tamazight, also known as Berber, spoken in North Africa, Jewish Malayalam, Krimchak, that Turkic language I mentioned, Judeo-Greek and Judeo-Italian, and Western Yiddish now have no speakers. And so they are considered to be dormant. And there's a little bit of engagement with Judeo-Italian. In Rome, they have a Jewish theater where they perform plays in Judeo-Italian, but no one speaks it natively, and it's dormant. Okay, so we get to question 5, the final question. How are Jews maintaining connections to their ancestral languages? I'm going to give you examples of this from 3 languages, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Iranian, and Jewish Neo-Aramaic. And for each, I'll give you a brief history of the language, talk about its current status, and the post-vernacular activity surrounding it. So Judeo-Arabic is spoken in these yellow areas here, which is a huge swath of land, and in each place, it was a little bit different. You may have heard of some famous writers who wrote in Judeo-Italian in the classical period, Saadia Gaon, Yehuda Halevi, the Rambam. They wrote in Judeo-Arabic in addition to writing in Hebrew. And the many varieties of Judeo-Arabic, like from Libya, Morocco, Iraq, etc., are mostly different from each other. They're mostly more similar to the way that their mostly Muslim neighbors spoke than to each other, but they also have some features in common because of migrations within the Arabic-speaking world. There were periodicals and translations of world literature into Judeo-Arabic. And things changed in the 1940s to the 1960s because most people who spoke Judeo-Arabic moved out of those lands and moved to Israel, France, Canada, Mexico, the United States, and elsewhere.
There was classical Judeo-Arabic, like you have classical Arabic.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Crosses borders.
Yeah, those texts. No, not that is still. I mean, yes, Jews today will sometimes use Fusha, like the classical Arabic that is common to different countries, but there isn't a Jewish version of that has been documented. Good question. Yeah.
Go back one. Last meeting in Egypt, the newspaper is Islam.
Yeah. So sometimes they had Hebrew names like Doresh Tov Le'amo, right? But these were even in Yeshurun. Even if they had Hebrew names, they were in Judeo-Arabic, mostly written in Hebrew letters. So there are still sizable Jewish communities in North Africa today, a bunch in Morocco, but most of them speak French, and some in Tunisia, but most of them speak similarly to their Muslim neighbors. However, there is a lot of post-vernacular engagement, especially in Israel. So here is an example of that post-vernacular engagement, Neta El Kayam. you want to turn it down on here? Okay, so I'm also going to play another little song from Yoni Avi Batat. He is an American Jew who is half Ashkenazi, half Mizrahi, and his Mizrahi family is from Iraq, and he got interested in his Iraqi heritage as a young adult and started learning a little Judeo-Arabic. The language had not been passed down to him. He talks about the difficulties of making his grandmother's kubeh recipe, and he says, she used to call me Abdalak, a term of endearment particular to Iraqi Jews. Here is a little clip from a song that he wrote that incorporates some Judeo-Arabic expressions that his grandmother used when cooking with him. Can you still hear it okay?
Parsley and mint, lemon and beets, baharat and dates, it needs something sweet. Your scribbled notes are guiding the way. If you were here, what would you say? شوي بدلت خذها كيفك عمري حس العجين عيوني خلي على ايدك حبيبي حس العجين عيوني خلي على.
Okay, it goes on. I know we could just spend the whole time listening to these beautiful songs. Here's another example of post-vernacular engagement with Judeo-Arabic. It's a Facebook group in Israel called Preserving the Iraqi Language. And what language are the posts in? They're mostly in Hebrew, but sometimes in Judeo-Arabic. And it's mostly things like, how do you say this in Iraqi, right? Here's a phrase I learned from my grandmother. So these are post-vernacular engagements with the language. So this language is in stage 8A. Most of the people who use it are elderly, right? It's moribund, but there is some post-vernacular use, and it's important for group identity among Mizrahi Jews. Turning now to Judeo-Iranian. In Iran, there were many cities that Jews lived in. And in each of these cities, they spoke in a way that was different enough that they really couldn't understand each other. Judeo-Persian is Persian written in the Hebrew script, and then languages like Judeo-Kashani, Judeo-Esfahani, Judeo-Shirazi are not written. They're mostly non-written Iranian languages that are etymologically distant and mutually unintelligible with Persian. So here's a little Persian language family tree. And that circle there, you see that purple circle? That is where these languages mostly are on the Iranian family tree, whereas Standard Persian is on this branch here, as is Bukharian and Juhuri.
You have either a couple of families related or the same small community that will understand each other and no one else?
Not just a couple of families, these were large communities.
Oh, really?
Yeah, these were cities in Iran.
They were isolated, like in this.
Exactly. I mean, in times before nationalist language policies where everyone had to learn the local language, this was much more common to have a lot of smaller languages in areas that didn't have that much contact. So just to give you a sense of how different these languages are, here's one word in a bunch of Iranian Jewish languages, the word for dog. In Judeo-Shirazi, it's actually a loan word from Hebrew, keleb. And then in these other languages, you can see some similarities, esbe, esbo, espo. But then in Judeo-Esfahani, kude and kuye and kuya, right? These are similar but different. And this is just one word. If you speak Judeo-Esfahani, you might understand some Judeo-Hamadani and vice versa, and Tuisarkani and Nahavandi, there are all these other little towns, right? But mostly you wouldn't understand them. And if you speak Standard Persian, which most Iranian Jews today do, you will not understand most of these other languages. And what's interesting is these dialects or languages, the Central Plateau dialects of the Kashan province were mostly replaced by Persian in the 20th century, not just among Jews, but these languages survive in a few rural communities of Zoroastrians and Muslims in Iran, and among elderly Jewish Kashani immigrants in the United States and Israel. So the Jews, because they moved away, have kept these languages alive to some extent. And just to show you the Hebrew influence in Judeo-Esfahani, the word Shabbat or Shabbat is part of every day of the week. So in Persian it would be Yekshanbe, in Judeo-Esfahani it would be Yeshabah, that kind of thing. So what happened to these languages? Well, in the mid-20th century, most Jews learned Standard Persian with some Hebrew words in their cities and towns, or after moving to Iran because of those nationalist language policies I mentioned before, and migrations. Most Jews left Iran from 1979 to the present, and now mostly live in New York, Los Angeles, and Israel. But there are efforts to document these language varieties. This is from the Endangered Language Alliance in New York, where they found people who speak these languages and are recording them. And I'm also working on that with the Jewish Language Project that I run at HUC. And here's just some clips of videos that Alan Niku, this guy, the younger man here, recorded.
It's so fast. That's so small.
You want to turn it up a little? Okay. Thank you.
The much.
Okay, well, here, I don't want to spend too much time, so.
Inshallah.
Okay. So these Iranian Jewish languages are in stage 8B. They're nearly extinct, and there is very little post-vernacular activity. And the final language I'm going to talk about today is Jewish Neo-Aramaic, and that is spoken right here in the Kurdish region, mostly in Iraq and Iran. These are ancient Jewish communities speaking a language that has been around since antiquity, but it has changed a lot since then. It is related to the Aramaic of the Talmud, but it's quite different. And some of these languages, and I say languages because they're not necessarily mutually intelligible, were spoken by several thousand Jews in a town. But like you said before, some of them were just spoken by a few families in a small village, and they would be the only people who understand that way of speaking. And interestingly, Jewish varieties of Neo-Aramaic resemble each other more than local Christian varieties. I say Christian because the Muslims, the Kurds, speak Kurdish, which is an Indo-European language, more similar to Persian. The Christians and the Jews in that area speak this Semitic language, Jewish Neo-Aramaic. And you can see how the three Jewish dialects here are more similar to each other than to the local Christian variety. So Jewish Neo-Aramaic speakers also spoke local languages because around the world this was the norm. Multilingualism. There were all these languages in one place. In America, we're weird. We only speak one language, most of us, right? So Kurdish, Turkish, Farsi, Arabic, and Russian. And these languages had an impact on the Aramaic that they spoke. For example, there's a phrase you say when a woman is pregnant in Hula Ula, Jewish Neo-Aramaic from Sanandaj, Iran, where you say Bakhta tre gyane, which means a woman with two souls. And that is an influence from the local Kurdish language. So what happened to Jewish Neo-Aramaic? Same story. Most speakers moved to Israel, some to the US and Europe. but there is some interest in this language, more than in the Iranian Jewish languages. Like, for example, Ariel Sabar, who wrote a book about his father, Yonah Sabar, and his language in particular from Zacho, Iraq. And in Israel, there's a lot of post-vernacular engagement. There are monthly cultural gatherings, poetry readings, stand-up comedy, TV, radio. There is the Lishana Institute, which advocates for Aramaic in Israel. And there is new music. Most of the people involved with these, though, are elderly, but there are some young people involved. Here's a theater called Kurdistan TV in Israel. I'll just play a little clip. So you can hear the audience is engaged. But it's mostly elderly in the audience. Here's a young woman who doesn't speak the language, so she wouldn't laugh at those jokes probably, but she is interested in her ancestral language. Adi Kadusi and Alona Zizi, they're both from Kurdish families in Israel, and here is her song about Aramaic. So there's only 12 words in the song. It's a basic Aramaic language lesson, and you can hear the contemporary style, right? Okay, so this language is in stage 8A, moribund, but there is some post-vernacular use, and it's important for group identity. So to wrap it up, most long-standing Jewish language varieties are moribund, and in the next 20 to 30 years, sadly, the last speakers will die. So it's a really important moment in Jewish history, because these are languages that have been around, some for centuries, some for millennia, and we have the opportunity right now to document them. And not just the language, but also the cultures and the histories that go along with them, and to share the knowledge with the next generation. So why? Why is this an important issue? Well, some speakers feel strongly about it, like Simon Mardachayev from New York, originally from Azerbaijan, who speaks Juhuri and wants to pass it on to the next generation and doesn't want his language to, he doesn't want to be one of the last speakers of that language. And to honor the memory of those who have passed away, like Sarah Cohen from Cochin, India, one of the last speakers of Jewish Malayalam. And for the younger generation, like Alan Niku, who is a filmmaker and a scholar and a heritage speaker of various Iranian Jewish languages, but he didn't know that. In fact, he knew that his family was Kurdish Jews, so he started learning Kurdish until he found out that's not actually the language his family spoke. So then he started learning Hula Ula, which is Jewish Neo-Aramaic from Sanandaj, Iran. And for him, this work is very important, and he is working with the Jewish Language Project to make films and to record interviews with native speakers. It's also important for academia, for people who want to do research on these communities. You can learn so much by learning a community's language. And for students who may someday want to learn these languages, if they want to and there's no record of them, then they can. But there's another important reason here, which is the sense of Jewish peoplehood. When Jews around the world learn about each other, they feel more connected to each other. And we see this in American Jewish classrooms, where there is so little history education, where most American Jewish educational institutions will teach about the biblical period, a little bit in the rabbinic period, and then they moved to the Holocaust in Israel, right? And that is something I'm trying to counter by creating curricular materials. I'll tell you about that in a second. But it's also important for other groups, for indigenous, immigrant, religious groups, to learn about how languages can be maintained in creative ways. And so I've learned from other groups like these Sri Lankan Tamils and Elampomo Indians and Hawaiians in Hawaii, how they've engaged with their language and taught their languages, even though the people in the community mostly speak English. And people in other communities like this can learn from the kinds of work that I'm doing. So how are we doing this work? Well, we brought together 12 organizations that work with Jewish languages, that do research and education about Jewish languages, and we work together to maximize efficiency. And the organization that I started, the Jewish Language Project, has the mission to promote research on, awareness about, and engagement surrounding the many languages spoken and written by Jews throughout history and around the world. And just to give you a sense of some of our current projects, I mentioned that we're documenting endangered Iranian Jewish languages. We also put out fun facts every week on social media, and we're working on an exhibit with ANU, Museum of the Jewish People, that's going to be exhibited not at ANU in Tel Aviv, but in other museums and JCCs and synagogues around the world. And we do events, concerts, and lectures. We have an event this Sunday about History of the World Part 2 and its use of Yiddish. And we create dictionaries. We have multilingual resources like that Rosh Hashanah shofarim image that I showed you at the beginning, or here we have the multilingual Omer calendar, where each day of the Omer was in a different language, that number, and it was an opportunity to teach about those languages. And we're working on this curriculum. We call it Beyond the Family Tree, Jewish History and Diversity Through Family, Languages, and Names. And if any of your synagogues are interested in piloting it, or schools, we just talk to me afterwards and I will set you up with the person who's coordinating that. And finally, I'm going to share a little musical clip and a final quote. This is from Galit Dardashti, whose family spoke Judeo-Esfahani and Judeo-Hamadani, but she didn't even know about that because she knew that her family spoke Persian because it had been a few generations, right? But we commissioned her to record songs in these languages. Okay, and finally, I'm going to end with this quote by Yoni Avi Batat. We want to enable young people to access fragments of their ancestral linguistic treasures. And I use the term fragments, which is the title of Yoni's album, From the Fragments. And I'm going to end with this quote. He says, "From the fragments of the voices, I can sing my own song. I'm singing my song." Thank you very much. Yeah, question.
So, my congregation is about split, like, half are above 75 and half are between 40 and 75.
Mm-hmm.
So we're obviously older, but I feel like that they would really be interested in a curriculum like that. I know you made it for kids, but this is a way of doing it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it really is geared toward kids, and in fact, part of it is interviewing a grandparent. But you can certainly take bits and pieces, and I mean, it's intended to be a curriculum where you draw what you want, and you might just use one lesson or something. So yeah, definitely.
They do it with their grandkids. Don't necessarily
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah.
I've had a young adult in Honolulu, and there a relationship between the Hawaiian chieftain, holy man, Kahuna, and our Kahuna? I never seem to find any tracing between
I know.
and Hawaiian per se, but it seems like too good to be a coincidence.
Right? I went there a few years ago and I had that same question. I think it's just a coincidence.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. What? 5 minutes. Got it. Okay. Other questions? Comments? Suggestions? Yeah.
I know you talk a lot about this, and I'm always struck by I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how these languages, even the post-vernacular, how they serve as kind of connection. Especially Jews living in diaspora, Jews living in a similar society, cultures, and communities, and how there's something that we can offer to encourage them.
Yeah, great question. I think that is one thing I'm trying to encourage, because I don't think most Jews are going to learn their ancestral languages, right? I mean, just look how it played out with Ashkenazi Jews in America. Most Jews didn't learn the Yiddish of their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, etc. But some are, and so I do think select few will want to learn Judeo-Arabic and Jewish Neo-Aramaic and these Jewish Iranian languages, but very few. And so I think a much more practical solution is this kind of post-vernacular engagement. So the work that we're doing at the Jewish Language Project to raise awareness. So like this image here, you're among the first to see this thank you in multiple languages. We're going to post that soon. And people will be like, whoa, I didn't know there were all these languages. Whoa, Jewish Malayalam, my family is from India. Let me find out more about that, right? That kind of thought process. And then also songs. I think songs are a very productive way to get people engaged with these languages and to teach them in schools. Because, in most schools, let's say for Hanukkah, they'll have songs in Hebrew and English, and Ocho Candelitas in Ladino, and maybe a Yiddish version of what? Oy Chaneke, Yanta, right? Ashena, right? And so, okay, so maybe we could incorporate others. We don't actually have any Hanukkah songs yet in other languages, but on our website we have a liturgy page with liturgy in other languages. This was especially productive in Ladino, so there's a lot of Ladino liturgy on that page, but we also have some Judeo-Greek and Judeo-Persian and various other languages. Yeah.
I was wondering if my community is a big batch of people who are really interested in lineage and genealogy and all that kind of stuff. So I love people they're already doing work on their history. So I feel like it gives me another resource to bring more things they remember and bring in another way, I'm thinking my population, up to your organization.
Yeah. Oh yeah, totally. So we have this website called the Jewish English Lexicon, and one of the goals there is to demonstrate the diversity of contemporary English-speaking Jews, not just in the U.S. and England, not just regionally, but also by ethnic group. And so there are many people who speak English but incorporate words from Ladino. But most American Jews don't know that. And Juhuri, spoken by the mountain Jews in Azerbaijan and Dagestan. And so we want those people to record their words for our website. So yeah, please connect them to me. Yeah. Okay. Thank you guys.